What's up, night owls? Welcome back to Demon Sleep. Real quick, drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from tonight. I personally read every single one of them, and honestly, it makes my day seeing you all from around the world. If these dark tailies help you drift off or just escape reality for a bit, smash that like button and subscribe. But only if you think we've earned it. No pressure. Alright, lights off. Rain on, blankets up. Let's dive into tonight's nightmare fuel. Story 1. The door that refused me. The city archives held secrets I wasn't prepared to face, but I'd never laid eyes on the Cartwright papers before. I arrived hunting facts about recovery homes after the war, safe terrain for a respectable book. The woman at the desk, Miss Petton, her age impossible to guess, her fingers unnervingly calm, pointed me toward something different. Fresh donation, she said, still waiting to be sorted. A private care service had sent them over, she told me. They'd handled home visits for the dying, decades of work. The owner died last month. No family, nobody left, so the records came here. The cartons bore only numbers in smudged handwriting. Inside lay patient folders, hundreds of them from 1945 to now, each stamped with the same phrase, successful passage. Strange word, you'd say successful treatment, successful healing, but passage, that word felt like an ending. I cracked open the first folder. Herbert Saunders, 83, cancer, died quietly at home under the care of Threshold Services. Inside were health charts, conversations with relatives, worker logs, but there was something else. Something that sent a chill through me I couldn't name. Precise measurements. The size of the bedroom, where the bed sat. The temperature when he died, not rounded but exact. 68.3 degrees. Across the room, Miss Petton sat working. I watched those eerily still hands of hers and wondered if she'd ever opened these files herself. The next folder, Dorothy Walter, same company, same obsessive spatial note, same phrase, successful passage. The worker's name wasn't written out, just initials, EMT. Third folder, George Bellamy, EMT again. Fourth folder, EMT. My pulse quickened. I pulled more. Nearly every file I touched bore those same three letters. I grabbed one from the oldest box, 1946, EMT. Another from 63, EMT. 98 still EMT. I began mapping it out, folder by folder, year by year. If this was one person, she'd been overseeing deaths for more than 70 years. The air in the reading room turned sharp and cold, though nothing had changed. The radiators ticked steadily along the wall, their rhythm unchanged. I went back to Herbert Saunders' folder and read deeper this time. A family interview, the signature illegible, held a description of the care worker. His daughter remembered her as gentle and focused, maybe 30 years old, dark hair, a stillness about her. She'd read aloud to Mr. Saunders near the end, the daughter said, held his hand, helped him, in her words, find peace with what he'd lived. I flipped to Dorothy Walter's file, 40 years later. Her son described the worker almost word for word. Gentle, focused, maybe 30, dark hair, that same quiet presence. It felt wrong. I couldn't say why yet. Tucked in the back of Dorothy's file was a photo, not of Dorothy, but of a woman in a care uniform standing in what looked like the agency's office. The date on the back, 1952. Estimated age, 30. I sat frozen, the photo between my fingers. Then I dug back into the first box, hunting for the agency's founding papers. Threshold Care Services, established 1945. Founder, Evelyn Ruth Threshold. A faded newspaper clipping from '85 announced her death at 70. It included an old photo from the 50s. The same woman. The same woman from Dorothy's file. The same woman, I realized with a sickening lurch, that families had described attending their loved ones all the way until last month. Miss Petton appeared beside my table. I hadn't heard her move. She asked if the materials had been helpful. I told her I'd be back tomorrow. She nodded, those unsettlingly calm hands already gathering the folders I'd left open, sliding them back into boxes with what felt like rehearsed precision. That night, alone in my rented room, I couldn't shake the measurements. Why track room temperature down to 1/10 of a degree? Why note the bed sat exactly 45 inches from the east wall? Why record the time of death down to the second, 3:17 and 23 a.m.? I returned the next morning. The Saunders file felt the most complete, maybe because I'd spent the most time with it, maybe because something in it demanded closer attention. I'd copied the daughter's contact information from the intake forms. It felt like crossing a line I couldn't see. But I called her anyway. Mrs. Judith Howe, she'd remarried since her father passed, agreed to meet me at a tea shop in Chelmsford, not far, close to where her father had spent his last months. She was in her 60s now, well-dressed, a composed kind of woman who'd clearly spent a lifetime managing hard things quietly. She remembered the care worker vividly. Her father had been dying of emphysema, she told me, a slow drowning, his lungs giving out bit by bit. He'd been terrified as the air left him. The doctor suggested a service, one that dealt with, as he put it, comfort at the end. Threshold care, sent someone the same day. Mrs. Howe described how the woman had changed everything in those final weeks. Where her father had been frantic, he became still. Where he'd fought and raged against his own dying, something like peace took hold. The woman had a gift, Mrs. Howe said. She made what was happening feel not just unavoidable, but right. She'd sit with him for hours, speaking softly, though Mrs. Howe could never quite catch the words. Her father, stubborn and harsh his whole life, became gentle, almost calm. I asked what the woman looked like. Mrs. Howe's description matched the photos, matched the other accounts. I slid the 1952 photograph across the table, the one from Dorothy's file, with the date written on the back. Mrs. Howe went pale. Her teacup rattled as she set it down, her hands shaking. That's impossible, she said. The woman who cared for her father had been young, maybe 30, certainly no older than 35. This photo was 70 years old. I didn't say anything. Mrs. Howe stared at the image for a long time. Then she said something I haven't stopped thinking about since. She told me that in his final hours, her father had become afraid again. Not of death, but of the woman. He tried to tell her something, but his breathing was too weak. The words fractured. What she thought he said, though she'd convinced herself she'd heard it wrong, was that the woman was showing him a door, that the door was open, and that something on the other side was looking back at him. He died at 3:17 and 23 seconds in the morning, smiling, reaching toward something Mrs. Howe couldn't see. The care worker had been holding his other hand. Mrs. Howe said she had the strangest feeling, that her father wasn't simply dying. He was being pulled, like someone pulling you through a doorway into another room. When it was over, the care worker let go of his hand, smoothed his blankets, and wrote the time in a small leather notebook she kept with her. Mrs. Howe had tried to thank her, she said. The woman told her, and here Mrs. Howe seemed to weigh every word carefully, that gratitude wasn't needed. She'd simply made sure Mr. Saunders passed through completely, that he hadn't been left lingering. I asked what she meant by lingering. Mrs. Howe didn't know. She said the woman left right after that. Never saw her again, even though she'd hired Threshold 5 years later when her mother was dying. A different worker came that time, capable enough, but without that particular quality the first woman had. Her mother passed quietly, but there was no sense of passage, no feeling of doorways, nothing beyond the simple stopping of breath and pulse. We said goodbye shortly after. Mrs. Howe asked me not to reach out again about this. She'd made peace with it, she said. She wanted it to stay buried. Walking back to the station, I kept thinking about those measurements in the file. The exact time, the temperature, the placement of the bed. They didn't read like medical records anymore. They read like coordinates. As if death didn't just require someone dying, but the right arrangement of space and time for something to happen. That night, I dreamed of doors opening in silent rooms, and of something waiting on the other side with what could have been patience, or could have been hunger. I couldn't tell. The third file I studied closely belonged to Ann Whitby, died in '89. Her case stood out. The notes called it remarkable because she'd been terrified of death, obsessively so. She'd spent her final months in near constant panic, refusing anything that might cloud her mind, convinced that sleep was just practice for the oblivion she feared. The worker assigned to her, EMT of course, had been specifically requested by her family doctor, who'd apparently seen the agency's work before. The notes tracked Mrs. Whitby's shift over 3 weeks. The panic didn't fade slowly. It stopped suddenly on the 9th day. After that, Mrs. Whitby wasn't just calm. She was eager, looking forward to her death with what the notes described as inappropriate. Excitement. I tracked down Mrs. Whitby's son through the directory. He'd relocated to Scotland, which felt important somehow, though I couldn't say why. Putting distance between himself and the place she died, maybe. Distance from whatever happened there. Robert Whitby agreed to speak by phone, but made it clear we wouldn't talk long. He was a lawyer, precise with words. He described his mother's final weeks with a detached clarity that barely masked deep unease. His mother had been terrified of dying since she was a child, he told me. Something about a drowning, never fully explained, left her convinced that death wasn't an ending. It was continuation, awareness without senses, a kind of eternal drowning. She'd made the family swear never to leave her alone, never to let her slip away unwatched, as if being observed might stop the thing she feared. The care worker showed up on a Tuesday. Mr. Whitby remembered because it was his mother's birthday. She'd spent it crying, certain it would be her last. The woman from the agency had been professional, soft-spoken. She had a way of touching his mother's hand that seemed to anchor her. Nothing strange there. Many caregivers have that practiced gentleness. What was strange was the shift. Second day, his mother stopped crying. Third day, she stopped asking for reassurance. By the end of the first week, she stopped sleeping. Not from fear, but because, as she told him, she didn't want to waste what time she had left. She had things to prepare for, she said. She needed to be ready. Mr. Whitby asked what she meant. His mother just smiled and said the care worker had shown her what came next, and it wasn't what she'd feared at all. In fact, it was extraordinary. She wouldn't give details, only that what the woman had shown her was private, between the two of them, and that he'd understand when his own time came. I asked if he'd ever spoken to the care worker about it. He'd tried, he said, once, after his mother had dozed off in her chair one of the last times she slept. He'd asked the woman what she'd told his mother, what she'd shown her to cause such a change. The care worker looked at him with what he called polite evaluation, as if deciding whether he could handle understanding. Then she said she'd shown his mother the other side. Not symbolically, not as faith or hope. She'd opened something, she said, and his mother had looked through. Mr. Whitby assumed it was therapeutic language, a comforting metaphor. But the woman kept talking. She explained that most people die without understanding what they're dying into, and that not knowing creates needless suffering. She'd learned over many years to offer clarity, to let them see what was waiting, so they could meet it without terror. I asked what his mother had seen. Mr. Whitby's voice tightened, became more measured. He said his mother told him, the night before she died, that she'd seen the place where the dead go on. Not heaven, not hell. Those words didn't fit. A place of awareness, she said, but changed. She'd seen others there, people she'd known, people she hadn't. They were occupied with something she couldn't put into words, something that demanded their presence, their focus. It wasn't suffering, it wasn't bliss. It was simply what followed. And she'd also seen his mother told him the things that didn't belong there, things that came to the threshold and were refused, sent back, left to linger in between. The care worker had shown her those too, his mother said, so she'd understand that crossing over wasn't automatic. You had to be ready. You had to be acceptable. His mother died reaching toward something, smiling. But the smile, Mr. Whitby said, wasn't entirely at peace. There was anticipation in it, yes, but also unease, like she was approaching a judgment whose verdict she couldn't guess. The care worker held her hand the entire time. Mr. Whitby watched her face, saw concentration there, effort, as if she were dragging his mother through something thick, something that resisted. When it ended, the woman let go and wrote her notes. Time of death, temperature, the angle of sunlight through the window measured in degrees from vertical. Mr. Whitby tried to thank her. She told him gratitude was early. His mother had passed through, which was the best result, but you could never be fully certain until some time had gone by. There were, she said, occasional complications, rejections. She would keep watch. He asked what she meant by that. She didn't answer, just gathered her things and left. Mr. Whitby told me he never contacted the agency again. Not when his father died 3 years later, not for his aunt, not for anyone. He didn't think his mother had been hurt exactly. She died peacefully, even gladly. But there had been something about the whole exchange that felt wrong to him. A crossing of lines he couldn't name, but felt certain should be there. I asked if he'd noticed anything odd after his mother passed. A long silence. Then he told me that for 3 nights afterward, he'd heard his mother's voice in the house, calling his name. Not upset, not pleading, just calling the way she used to when he was young and supper was on the table. He'd searched the house each time, found nothing. Eventually the calls stopped. He told himself it was grief, auditory tricks, the mind refusing to accept loss. But sometimes, he said, he wondered if his mother had been calling from wherever she'd gone, trying to reach back, and whether the care workers monitoring had meant making sure those calls eventually ended. We hung up shortly after. Mr. Whitby asked me, like Mrs. Howe had, not to reach out again. Some things, he said, are better left alone. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept thinking about what Mrs. Whitby had seen, about the things turned away at the threshold, forced to linger in between. I thought about the measurements, the coordinates, the idea that dying might not be an event but a crossing that could fail, leaving something stranded. I'd been working in the archives for a week when I found the exception. Most cases were marked successful passage. But this one, labeled simply incomplete, 1997, described a failure. The patient was Donald Marsh, 76 years old. The worker was EMT. The notes said Mr. Marsh had been an unsuitable candidate, though what made someone unsuitable wasn't explained. The passage had been attempted, but not completed. Mr. Marsh had, in the file's sterile language, remained suspended between states for roughly 11 minutes before dying in the conventional sense. A second note in different handwriting said the assigned care worker had been let go following the incident and had filed a formal complaint about inadequate training. A name was given, Claire Dixon. When I asked, Miss Petton told me the agency had donated several boxes of employee records. It took me 2 hours to find Claire Dixon's file. She'd worked for Threshold Care for exactly 3 weeks in the summer of '97. Her termination notice cited psychological unsuitability for required duties and recommended she find work in fields that didn't involve the dying. The file had an address, 25 years old now, but directory assistants found a C. Dixon in Brighton. I called her that evening. Claire Dixon agreed to meet, but only somewhere public and only in daylight. We met at a cafe near the Brighton Pier. The clatter of arcade games and the screaming gulls gave us a kind of buffer against what we were about to discuss. She was younger than I'd imagined. Early 20s when she worked for the agency, not even 50 now, but she carried herself like someone much older, a tiredness in her eyes that spoke of wounds that never closed. She told me she'd taken the job because she'd been training as a hospice nurse. The agency paid far better. The position was described as specialized end-of-life care, comfort and guidance for the dying. She'd assumed it would be like hospice work, just more focused. One patient at a time, families present, gentle deaths made easier. The training had been strange from the beginning. No formal classes, no certification. Instead, she was paired with the senior care worker. She didn't say EMT, but I knew on what they called an observational assignment. The senior worker would show her the proper method. She would learn by watching. The patient was an elderly man, Mr. Marsh, dying of liver failure, alert, lucid but fatting. The family had been asked to leave for the evening. Standard procedure, Claire was told. The actual moment of crossing was easier without witnesses who might become upset. The senior care worker had been kind with Mr. Marsh, even warm. She talked to him at length about what was coming, explained that death was a threshold, a door opening onto something that continued. She said she would help him through, that he didn't need to be afraid, that she'd guided hundreds before and knew the way. Then she did something Claire couldn't explain. She placed her hands on either side of Mr. Marsh's head, very gently, and she seemed to focus with enormous intensity. Mr. Marsh's breathing shifted, became quick and shallow. His eyes went distant, unfocused. And then Claire said, and here her own breathing quickened, her hands tightening around her cup, she saw it. The door, not symbolically, an actual opening in the air beside the bed, a space where there shouldn't be one, a threshold leading somewhere else. I must have looked doubtful, because Claire stopped and asked if I wanted her to go on, or if I'd already decided she was unhinged. I told her to continue. She said the senior care worker began pulling Mr. Marsh through. Not physically, his body stayed in the bed, but something of him was being drawn toward the opening, extracted slowly, the way you'd ease something fragile from its casing. Claire watched Mr. Marsh's face twist, watched his mouth fall open as if to speak or scream, though nothing came out. And for just a moment, she saw what was on the other side. She couldn't describe it, she said. She tried for years to find words that fit what she'd glimpsed, but nothing in ordinary life came close. It was a place, certainly. There were others there, and there was something else, something observing, weighing, deciding what could enter and what couldn't. Mr. Marsh, it seemed, couldn't. Whatever was on the other side had refused him. Claire watched the senior care worker pull harder, her face strained, even pained, as if she were trying to force Mr. Marsh through against something pushing back. And then something happened that Claire still sees when she closes her eyes. Mr. Marsh became stuck. Halfway through, neither alive nor dead, suspended in the threshold itself. His body on the bed kept breathing, his heart kept beating, but his eyes were hollow. And from the opening in the air came a sound like fabric tearing, like something being ripped along a seam it was never meant to cross. The senior care worker tried for 11 minutes to finish the passage. Claire watched, frozen, unable to look away or step in. Finally, the woman stopped, pulled her hands back, the opening sealed shut. Mr. Marsh's body died in the normal way moments later. But Claire said she knew. She knew that whatever he'd been was still there, caught in the threshold, neither in life nor beyond it, aware but unable to move or cry out or stop. She threw up in the bathroom afterward. Resigned that night. The senior care worker tried to talk her out of it, explained that failures like this were uncommon, that Mr. Marsh had been unsuitable from the start, that better screening would prevent it happening again. Claire refused. She left and never went back. But leaving didn't help. Claire told me she can't be near anyone dying now. Not patients, not friends, not even her own mother, who died alone in a hospital 3 years ago while Claire sat in her car in the lot, unable to go inside. Because every time someone starts to die, she sees it again. The threshold opening. The awful possibility that the person might get trapped, might spend forever caught in that in-between space, aware but frozen. She asked why I was looking into the agency. I told her about the files, about the woman who seemed to have been attending deaths for 70 years without growing older. Claire nodded, not surprised. She said the senior care worker had told her during those brief training days that the work changed you, that each passage you helped someone through added something, gave you something, took something. She'd been doing it since 1945, the woman had said, since the war, when she'd learned what the moment of death truly was. Not an ending, a transition, one that could be shaped, directed, controlled. Claire asked me to promise her something. She asked me not to die alone, not to let anyone send someone from an agency like that, no matter how much peace they promised. Because death, she said, should happen naturally, without help, without guidance. Whatever comes next, we should meet it on our own terms. not through doors opened by others who have their own reasons for making passage easier. I promised, though I wasn't sure I could keep it. We parted outside the cafe. Claire walked toward the pier, shoulders pulled in against the wind. She looked like someone who'd witnessed something they were never supposed to see and had been trying to forget it for decades. That night, I dreamed of Mr. Marsh, trapped in a doorway that had closed around him, aware, conscious, unable to die or live or do anything but exist in that frozen moment between. I woke with the taste of metal in my mouth and the sick certainty that somewhere, in some space I couldn't name, he was still there. I went back to the archives the next morning, determined to find answers. Miss Petton didn't seem surprised by my urgency. She asked if I'd been sleeping well. I told her I hadn't. She nodded, said the files had that effect on some people. She suggested I look more closely at the agency's founding documents. There might be, she said, context that would help. I spent the day buried in administrative records. Threshold Care Services had been founded in 1945 by Evelyn Ruth Threshold, a former military nurse, field hospitals during the war. The mission statement was ordinary enough to offer dignified, compassionate end-of-life care to those dying at home. Client testimonials were overwhelming. The financial records showed consistent work for 40 years. But there were other documents, buried deeper in the boxes. Training manuals, though they read less like medical instruction and more like ritual teaching. Diagrams of room layouts, optimal timing for facilitated crossings, techniques for threshold navigation, and recruitment materials, letters to former nurses and hospice workers, inviting them to join what the letters called a lineage of guidance. Most had declined. Some accepted and quit within weeks. Their files held exit interviews describing mental anguish, inability to carry out assigned tasks, recurring nightmares. Very few stayed. Their names appeared throughout the files I'd been reading, but always as secondary workers, never with the initials EMT. It seemed the agency had been, fundamentally, a training operation. Miss Threshold trying to pass on her unique ability to create others who could do what she did. But most couldn't endure it. I found a letter dated 1962 from Miss Threshold to an unnamed colleague. She described her frustration with recruitment. The work was essential, she wrote. Death was changing. The threshold that had once opened smoothly, that had received the dying with what she called appropriate receptivity, had started to resist. Since the mid-50s, she'd noticed growing difficulty in facilitating passage. Some of the dead were being denied entry, turned back, though she couldn't identify what made someone acceptable or not. She was worried, she wrote, about what would happen when her own time arrived. Would she pass through, or would the threshold that had accepted so many under her guidance refuse her, leave her stranded like Mr. Marsh, suspended between states? She needed to understand the rules before her own death came. And she needed others who could investigate from the other side, who could figure out what had shifted and why. The letter ended there. No signature, no sign it was ever mailed. I sat in the reading room as the afternoon dimmed, thinking about a woman who'd learned to open doors between life and what followed, who'd spent 70 years trying to understand the presence on the other side. The presence that had started saying no. Miss Petton appeared beside my desk, lamp in hand, to tell me the archives were closing. Then she hesitated. There was one other box, she said. It had been marked personal. Strictly speaking, it shouldn't be here at all. But in the interest of thorough research, she thought I might want to see it. She brought it to my desk without asking. I spent another restless night thinking about thresholds, about the things that guard them, about a woman who made herself timeless through other people's deaths, and about what might be waiting in that last box. The box held a journal, leather-bound, Evelyn Ruth Threshold stamped on the cover. Entries spanning from 1945 to the present year. But the handwriting never changed. The same careful lettering, the same black ink, as if 70 years had passed without touching her hand. I turned to the first entry. April 17, 1945. She'd been a nurse in a field hospital outside Cologne when she witnessed the first death of the new kind. A young soldier dying from wounds she couldn't repair had reached the moment of crossing. That instant when the body lets go and something else should happen. But it didn't happen. The soldier stayed, breath stopped, heart silent, but his eyes open and aware. Trapped, she realized, in the moment of death itself, unable to finish the crossing. She watched for 3 hours as he existed in that state, conscious but unable to respond, living his own dying, but unable to die completely. Finally, mercifully, something gave way and he passed through. But the incident shook her deeply. Over the weeks that followed, she saw it again and again. Soldiers who should have slipped away cleanly instead became stuck, caught between states, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours. The pattern was spreading. Where death had once been immediate, a threshold crossed in a heartbeat, it was becoming labored, blocked, as if something on the other side had started shutting the door. She began experimenting. She found that if she was present at the moment of death, if she focused her mind in a certain way, she could ease the crossing. The door that was closing could be held open. The dying could be guided through. It required focus, physical contact, and something else she couldn't name. An understanding of death not as an ending, but as movement through a specific threshold that existed in a specific location. She became skilled at it. The soldiers she cared for died smoothly, quickly, without that awful suspension. And she began noticing something else. Each death she facilitated gave her something. Not youth exactly, but a kind of temporal stillness. She stopped aging. Wounds healed faster than they should. She needed less sleep, less food. As if each successful crossing anchored her more tightly to life, a balance against the death she shepherded. After the war, she founded the agency. Someone had to do this work, she reasoned. Death was shifting, becoming harder. People needed help making the crossing. She would provide that help, and she would study it, understand it, master it. The journal entries grew more precise after 1950. She documented hundreds of deaths, noting patterns, oddities, successes, and failures. She described the threshold in greater and greater detail, not as symbol, but as an actual location, a space existing beside the dying body, visible only to those who understood how to perceive it. But it was getting harder. By the 60s, she was meeting resistance in nearly half her cases. The threshold would open, the dying would begin to cross, and then something on the other side would assess them, weigh them, and sometimes refuse them. She couldn't figure out the standard. Age didn't matter. Morality seemed beside the point. Some gentle elderly souls were turned back, while thoroughly cruel people passed through easily. She started to suspect the presence on the other side wasn't judging character, but something else entirely. Fitness for whatever existed beyond. As if death didn't lead to reward or suffering, but to some form of ongoing existence that demanded specific traits, specific capacities, and those who lacked them were denied. In 1975, she wrote an entry that disturbed me profoundly. She'd overseen the death of a woman terrified of dying, convinced oblivion was waiting. Miss Threshold had shown her the threshold, let her see a glimpse of what lay beyond. The woman's terror turned to longing. She died reaching toward it, smiling. But Miss Threshold noted that she'd shown the woman only the initial view, the first layer of what existed beyond. She hadn't shown her what came after that, the things she herself had witnessed in the depths of the threshold when she looked too long. Because there were layers, she wrote. The first was inviting, populated by the dead who'd crossed successfully, occupied in some form of continued being she couldn't fully grasp. But deeper past that, there were other things. Things that weren't dead and weren't alive. Things that observed. Things that had been refused and had become something else through rejection. Not ghosts, not spirits, but consciousnesses frozen in the threshold itself, aware but immobile, gathering in the space between life and death like silt. She'd shown some of her patients only the first layer, the reassuring view. Others, those who demanded full honesty, she'd shown everything. The latter group died calm but not peaceful, accepting but not eager, understanding exactly what they were stepping into. The entries after 1985, the year she was supposed to have died, grew stranger. She wrote about staging her death to escape questions about her unchanging appearance. She created new identities, kept the agency running under different structures, trained new workers who always failed or ran. She was alone in this, she wrote, and growing weary. Not physically, the death she guided still sustained her, but existentially. She'd been present for over 3,000 deaths, opened the threshold that many times, and each opening left her slightly more altered, slightly more tethered to that in-between space. She'd formed theories about why the threshold began shutting. In entries from the late 50s, she wondered if it might be linked to atomic testing. Something about splitting atoms had torn reality in ways that echoed elsewhere, perhaps damaged the threshold itself. Later, she abandoned this idea. The resistance had started before Hiroshima, she realized, reviewing her earliest cases. It began during the war, in those field hospitals, when death was happening at industrial scale. Maybe, she wrote in '67, it was the sheer volume of dead that caused the problem. The threshold had never been built, if built was even the right word, to handle millions at once. Maybe something on the other side became swamped, started refusing entry simply because there was no more space, no more capacity for continuation. But she eventually rejected this theory too. The resistance wasn't about quantity, it was about quality. The presence on the other side wasn't overwhelmed. It was choosing. It had developed standards, benchmarks, preferences, as if death had evolved from automatic passage to active selection. Her most unsettling theory, recorded in '73 and never fully explored, suggested that the dead themselves had changed. Something about modern consciousness, the way people thought, perceived, existed, had made them unfit for whatever waited beyond. She wondered if it was cities, the separation from natural rhythms, Or technology, the way machines filtered every experience, or maybe just the modern world itself. The mental structure needed to survive contemporary existence, which might make you incompatible with whatever form of being the threshold opened onto. She never found an answer. Every theory led nowhere. The standard stayed hidden. She was starting to suspect she couldn't die normally. She'd become too intertwined with the threshold itself. When her moment arrived, she'd need someone to guide her through, someone who knew the method as well as she did. But there was no one. Every trainee had broken or bolted. The most recent entries from this past year showed mounting panic. The threshold was barely opening anymore. She had to wrench it, hold it open through sheer force. And even then, the presence on the other side was rejecting more than half her clients. She wrote about Mr. Marsh, didn't use his name, but I knew the case. Her anguish at leaving him stranded. She tried for almost 20 minutes after Claire fled, she wrote, but couldn't finish his crossing or draw him back. He was still there, she was sure, suspended, aware, enduring something that had no physical equivalent. She was hunting for the pattern. Why were some allowed through and others turned away? She'd started recording every detail of successful versus failed crossings, searching for clues. Room temperature, time of day, the dying person's final words, the slant of light, furniture placement. Anything might matter. Anything might be the key to understanding what the presence on the other side wanted. Because it wanted something. She was certain of that. It wasn't simply sorting the dead by moral or spiritual worth. It was selecting for something precise, some trait or ability the dead would need for whatever followed. And it was growing pickier. The criteria were tightening. Soon, she feared, it would refuse everyone. The threshold would seal permanently, leaving the dying caught in that horrific suspension, unable to live, unable to die, unable to do anything but exist in the frozen instant of their own cessation. The final entry was dated 2 weeks ago. She wrote that she'd received a terminal diagnosis. Cancer advanced beyond surgery. Maybe 3 months left. She needed to crack the pattern before her own death arrived. She needed to know if she'd be accepted or refused. And if refused, she needed to figure out whether it was possible to push your way through, to override the verdict, to cross despite being turned back. She was planning one last test. She would attempt to guide herself through using methods she developed, but never tried. She would open the threshold, step through, and see what occurred. If she was refused, she'd record the experience, assuming she could still think while trapped. The entry stopped there. The next page was empty. I sat in the silent reading room, the journal still open in front of me, and understood. Miss Threshold had died 2 weeks ago. The agency had shut down, the files sent here. She'd attempted her experiment, and either succeeded or failed. Either she'd crossed over, or she was caught like Mr. Marsh, frozen in the threshold, aware but unable to die or live or do anything except exist in that suspended instant between. And if she'd succeeded, if she'd discovered how to force passage despite rejection, what did that mean for the presence on the other side? What did it mean for death itself? Miss Petton appeared beside my desk. The archives were closing, she said. But there was something else. A woman had called that afternoon, she said, asking about me. She'd identified herself as a representative of Threshold Care Services, said she needed to speak with me urgently. She'd left a number. I stared at Miss Pettin. The agency had collapsed 2 weeks ago. There was nobody left to represent. Miss Pettin handed me a slip of paper, the number written in her precise handwriting. She suggested I might want to call from the reading room before leaving. Mobile signal was poor in the building. Then she withdrew to her desk, those eerily calm hands folded in front of her. Waiting. I dialed. It rang twice before someone picked up. The voice was steady, professional, unmistakably a woman in her 30s. She thanked me for calling, asked if I'd be free to meet tomorrow. She'd reviewed my research, she said, thought we might have overlapping interests to explore. There were elements of the agency's operations, she said, not fully captured in the files, things requiring face-to-face explanation. I asked who she was. A pause. Then she said her name was Evelyn Threshold, and she'd assumed control of the agency following the previous director's retirement. The work was too vital to abandon, she explained. Someone had to shepherd the dying through. Someone had to make sure they didn't get stuck. I told her the files showed Evelyn Threshold had died 2 weeks ago. She laughed, a soft, courteous sound. Said there seemed to be some confusion. The former director had indeed passed away, but she wasn't the founder. The founder had stepped down years ago. There had been some mix-up in the records. Perhaps, but she'd be glad to clarify when we met. She suggested we meet at a client's home tomorrow evening. A facilitated crossing was scheduled. She thought I might gain more from witnessing the process firsthand. It would, she said, answer many of my questions better than words alone could. I should have said no. Should have hung up, left the archives, returned to my safe research on recovery institutions, forgotten about thresholds and the things that guard them. But I didn't. I agreed to meet her. She gave me an address in Finchley, told me to arrive at 9 in the evening. The crossing would happen shortly after. She asked if I had any health issues that might make me unfit for observation. I didn't understand the question. She explained that some observers experience distress, occasionally severe, and wanted to make sure I was ready. I told her I was ready. She said she'd see me tomorrow, and ended the call. I sat in the silent reading room, the journal still open, and wondered what I just committed to. Miss Pettin was watching from her desk. She asked if I was all right. I told her I wasn't sure. She nodded, said that sometimes in the course of research, you encounter things that can't be grasped from afar. Sometimes direct observation becomes necessary, even when it's unwise. She asked if I'd be returning to the archives after my meeting. I didn't know how to answer. That night I didn't sleep. I read through Miss Threshold's journal again, focusing on her descriptions of the threshold itself, of the presence waiting on the other side, of the standards for acceptance or refusal. I wanted to understand what I was about to see, what I was walking into. The house in Finchley was ordinary. A semi-detached home on a quiet street, lights glowing downstairs, a car in the drive. I arrived at exactly 9. The woman who answered the door was someone I recognized from the 1952 photograph. She hadn't aged. Her dark hair, her composed expression, that quality of absolute stillness. All exactly as recorded 70 years ago. She introduced herself as Evelyn Threshold, welcomed me inside with flawless politeness. The dying man was upstairs, she explained. Arthur Holbrook, 81, terminal heart disease. The family had requested facilitated crossing. They were waiting in the kitchen. It was generally better, she said, for loved ones not to witness the actual moment of transition. I would be allowed to watch because I was a researcher. I'd process it clinically, she said, not emotionally. We went upstairs. The bedroom had been arranged with precision. Bed pulled from the wall, curtains shut, a single lamp casting measured light. Mr. Holbrook was awake, propped against pillows, his breathing labored but rhythmic. He glanced at me without interest, then turned his focus back to Miss Threshold. She spoke to him softly, told him what was coming. She would guide him across the threshold, she said. Make sure he passed completely, that he didn't get stuck or stranded. He had nothing to worry about. She'd done this thousands of times. She knew the route. Mr. Holbrook nodded. He seemed serene, resigned, though I couldn't tell if that came naturally or if she'd induced it somehow. Miss Threshold asked him to close his eyes, to follow her voice. She placed her hands on either side of his head, gently, and began to focus. I watched her face transform. The polite professionalism vanished, replaced by searing concentration. And something else. Exertion, tension, as if she were trying to hoist something impossibly heavy. Mr. Holbrook's breathing shifted, became quick and thin. His eyes, though shut, darted beneath the lids, tracking something. And then I saw it. The threshold. Not symbolically. An actual tier in the air beside the bed. A vertical split where space itself seemed to peel open. Through it I could see. But see doesn't capture it. I perceived a place that shouldn't exist, couldn't exist. A continuation of space that broke every rule of physical reality. There were others there. The dead, I assumed, though they didn't look dead. They looked busy, absorbed in something I couldn't grasp, something demanding their focus and participation. And beyond them, deeper inside, there were other things. Enormous things. Things that watched with an attention that felt like weight pressing against my eyes. Miss Threshold was drawing Mr. Holbrook toward the threshold. Not his body, that stayed in the bed, but something of him, something I could almost make out, a shape that mirrored his physical form but wasn't physical. She was extracting it slowly, carefully, steering it toward that split in the air. Mr. Holbrook's form neared the threshold, and then something on the other side began examining him. I felt it happen, though I couldn't explain how. A massive attention locked onto Mr. Holbrook, studied him, weighed him against standards I couldn't begin to comprehend. I saw Miss Threshold's face harden with strain as she tried to push him through. I saw Mr. Holbrook's form start to cross the threshold, halfway into that other place, and I saw the presence on the other side reject him. The refusal wasn't brutal. It was simply final. Mr. Holbrook's form stopped moving forward. Miss Threshold pulled harder, her face twisted with effort that bordered on agony. But the threshold wouldn't take him. Something essential was missing, or present, some quality that made crossing impossible. I watched Mr. Holbrook become stuck, exactly as Clara described. Halfway through, neither alive nor dead. His body in the bed still breathing, but his eyes hollow. And from the threshold came that sound like fabric ripping, like reality tearing along seams that were never supposed to exist. Miss Threshold kept pulling. 3 minutes 5:10. I could see what it was costing her, the tremor in her hands, the ragged edge of her breathing. Mr. Holbrook stayed suspended, trapped, and I understood with crushing horror that he was aware. Whatever part of him had been drawn out was conscious, experiencing the threshold, unable to move forward or backward, unable to do anything except exist in that frozen instant of refusal. At 12 minutes, Miss Threshold stopped. She let go and stepped back. The threshold stayed open. Mr. Holbrook's form caught inside it. His body in the bed kept functioning, heart pumping, lungs filling. But he wasn't there. He was imprisoned in that other place. And he would stay there indefinitely. Miss Threshold turned to me. Her face was drained, exhausted, but her voice stayed level. "This is what I wanted you to witness," she said. "This is what death has become." I couldn't speak. I stared at Mr. Holbrook, at the terrible consciousness in that suspended shape, at the presence on the other side that had deemed him unacceptable and abandoned him there. Miss Threshold explained, with the same composed courtesy she'd shown at the door, that she'd been trying to crack the pattern for 30 years. She documented thousands of crossings, analyzed every variable, and she couldn't figure out what the presence on the other side wanted. It accepted some, refused others, and the refusals were climbing. Soon, she believed, it would refuse everyone. The threshold would seal for good, and every death would end like this. Suspended, stranded, conscious but unable to die. She'd been the former director's successor, she said. The founder had trained her, passed the method on before attempting her own crossing 3 weeks ago. The founder had been refused. She was still there, in the threshold, caught like Mr. Holbrook. Miss Threshold visited her regularly, tried to pull her through. But she couldn't. The presence on the other side had rendered its verdict. I asked why she. "Show me this," she said, because she needed help. The founder had believed the pattern could be decoded, that with enough data, enough scrutiny, something would surface. But Miss Threshold had come to a different conclusion. The standards weren't fixed. They were shifting, evolving, tightening. Whatever existed on the other side was selecting for something particular. And that something was becoming vanishingly scarce. She needed researchers, she said, people who could examine the data without the weight of direct involvement, people who could map patterns, build theories, test possibilities. The work was too critical to abandon. If death itself was becoming impossible, if everyone who died would be left frozen in that threshold forever, then understanding why was the most pressing question humanity had ever faced. I looked at Mr. Holbrook, at his body in the bed, his consciousness imprisoned in that other place. I thought about Claire's mother, dying alone in a hospital while her daughter sat paralyzed in the parking lot, unable to witness another failed crossing. I thought about Mr. Marsh, suspended for 27 years in that arrested instant. I thought about the founder, caught in the threshold she'd opened thousands of times, denied entry to the place she'd spent 70 years trying to comprehend. I told Miss Threshold I couldn't help her. I couldn't be part of this. Whatever she was doing, whatever the agency had been doing, it was wrong in ways I couldn't name but felt with absolute conviction. She nodded, unsurprised. She said most people reacted that way. But the work would go on. Someone had to shepherd the dying, even if crossing was no longer assured. Someone had to bear witness, gather evidence, hunt for answers. The alternative was letting people die alone, unguided, trapped without anyone even knowing they were trapped. She walked me to the door. Before I left, I asked what would happen to Mr. Holbrook. She said his body would die in the conventional sense within hours. The family would think he'd passed peacefully. Only she would know he stayed suspended, stranded, aware. She would keep watch over him, she said, the way she watched all the failed crossings. Hundreds of them now, scattered across the threshold, unable to die or live, piling up like debris in that space between. I left the house and walked to the station through streets that suddenly felt menacing. Air that tasted corrupted. I didn't return to the archives right away. I spent 3 days in my rented room, unable to sleep, unable to eat, unable to think about anything except what I'd seen. Mr. Holbrook frozen in the threshold. The founder trapped. Hundreds of others collecting in that space. Between life and what follows, conscious but frozen, experiencing a state that shouldn't be possible. On the second day, I tried returning to my real work. I opened my notes on recovery institutions, read through chapters on post-war rehabilitation programs, tried focusing on the perfectly legitimate academic study I'd been writing before I stumbled onto the Cartwright collection. The words felt empty. The careful examination of institutional frameworks, the documented improvements in patient care, the evolution of treatment protocols. All of it suddenly felt shallow, a performance of scholarship about surfaces, while the true nightmare existed in depths I hadn't known were there. I sat at my desk and couldn't type a single sentence that didn't feel like a fiction. How could I write about therapeutic care when I'd witnessed what care actually meant? How could I discuss institutional success when I knew organizations existed that shepherded people to their deaths through metaphysical doorways, where success was measured by whether consciousness got permanently stuck in the gaps between existence? The ordinary world of academia had become impossible. I'd been contaminated by knowledge, and there was no path back to not knowing. When I finally returned to the archives, Miss Petton was waiting. She'd packed the boxes for storage, she said. My research was finished. I nodded, started collecting my notes. She asked if my meeting had been informative. I told her it had been. Then I asked her something I'd been wondering since that first day, when she'd set those boxes in front of me with what I now recognized as relief. I asked if she'd known what the files contained, if she'd pointed me toward them deliberately. Miss Petton's hands, those eerily calm hands, folded on the desk in front of her. She said she'd read the files, yes, found them disturbing. And when a researcher arrived asking about recovery institutions, she thought perhaps someone should look at them more carefully. Someone should know what threshold care had been doing, what it was still doing. I asked if she'd contacted the agency herself. She hadn't. She said she was simply an archivist. Her job was to preserve materials and make them accessible to researchers. What researchers chose to do with those materials wasn't her business. But she asked me, in a tone that suggested more than professional interest, whether I'd found what I was searching for, whether I'd learned what death had become. I told her I'd learned that death was no longer an ending. It was a threshold, and the threshold was closing. that something on the other side had started refusing passage, leaving. People stranded in that in-between, frozen in a state that wasn't living and wasn't gone. That hundreds were suspended there now, maybe thousands, building up in that space like pressure behind a failing wall. And eventually, the wall would give, and something catastrophic would unfold. Miss Petton nodded slowly. She said she'd suspected as much. The files had hinted at it, though she hadn't wanted to accept it. She asked what I planned to do with what I'd uncovered. I told her I had no idea. Publishing felt absurd. Who would accept it? Warning people felt pointless. Warn them of what? That death itself was breaking down. That when their moment came, they might be turned away from whatever lies beyond, and left hanging in limbo, conscious but paralyzed, in a threshold that might never let them go. Miss Petton suggested I could frame it as fiction. People often digest truth more easily when it's dressed as imagination, she said. They could wrestle with the ideas without the weight of having to believe them. And maybe someone who needed to know would sense the reality beneath the invention. I collected my notes and walked out of the archives. I didn't say goodbye to Miss Petton. I just left, stepped into afternoon sun that felt too harsh, air that felt too thin. A world going about its ordinary business, while death itself crumbled. That night, I started writing. Not as analysis, not as evidence, but as the story you've just finished reading. A framed account of a researcher stumbling onto files about an agency that steers the dying through a metaphysical doorway. Segments detailing individual deaths, each peeling back another layer of dread. A central thread following the founder herself, the woman who discovered how to open the threshold and spent 70 years trying to understand the presence guarding it, and now writing this ending. I have to admit something I've understood since leaving that house in Finchley, but haven't wanted to face. The files in the archive weren't misplaced. They were planted deliberately. Miss Petton didn't guide me to them by accident. The agency wanted someone to find them, wanted someone to sift through the evidence, study the patterns, help them decode why the threshold was sealing shut. And when Miss Threshold called, she wasn't just inviting me to watch. She was assessing me, testing whether I could perceive the threshold, whether I had the capacity to learn the method, whether I might be fit for training. Because the agency is still recruiting, still hunting for those rare few who can see the threshold, who can endure guiding people across, even knowing most would be rejected, who could keep doing the work of shepherding people toward a door that's steadily slamming shut. 3 days ago, a letter arrived. No return address, but I knew the handwriting from the journal. Miss Threshold thanked me for my curiosity about the agency's operations. She understood my hesitation to get involved directly, but she wanted me to know the offer stood. The work was too essential to walk away from. Death was collapsing, and someone had to figure out why. The letter came with a pamphlet, training materials, instructions on how to see the threshold, how to ease the crossing, how to guide people through even when the presence on the other side turns them away. She'd marked one section. It explained that facilitators don't age, that each successful crossing adds something to them, roots them deeper into life, that those who do the work can continue without end, gathering experience, gathering insight, gathering the strange temporal anchoring that comes from leading the dead onward. I should burn the pamphlet. I should refuse completely. I should erase everything I saw in that house in Finchley. But I keep thinking about Mr. Holbrook, frozen in the threshold. About the founder, trapped there for weeks now, aware but unable to die. About Claire's mother, dying alone in a hospital because her daughter couldn't stand to be there. About all the deaths happening right now, everywhere, all over the world. People crossing that threshold unguided, getting stuck, stranded, piling up in that space between. Someone has to understand why. Someone has to find the pattern, crack the code, learn what the presence on the other side wants. And someone has to be there when people die, to try to help them across. Even if crossing isn't guaranteed anymore. Last night I dreamed I was in a dim room, hands positioned on either side of someone dying. Focusing with crushing effort as I try to pry open the threshold. In the dream I could see it. That vertical tier in space, that opening into somewhere else. And I could see what waited on the other side, watching, weighing, refusing. In the dream I kept going. I kept trying to guide them through, even knowing they'd likely be turned back, even knowing they might get trapped. Because someone had to try. Someone had to be present. I woke with the feeling that my hands weren't entirely mine anymore. That they were steadier than they should be. That they were ready for work I hadn't yet agreed to. This morning, another letter came. Same handwriting. Miss Threshold has enrolled me in observational training next week. A dying woman in Kensington, terminal diagnosis, family requesting facilitated. Crossing. Miss Threshold will show me the method. I'll observe and absorb. I haven't agreed to any of this. I haven't replied to her letters. But somehow she knows I'll show up. I'll show up because I witnessed Mr. Holbrook caught in the threshold, and I can't stop seeing him. Because I read the founder's journal and understood that death has become a doorway that's shutting, and when it closes entirely, everyone who dies will be left hanging, aware but unable to finish. I'll show up because Miss Petton set those files in front of me knowing what I'd discover, knowing what it would do to me, knowing I wouldn't be able to turn away. And I'll show up because my hands this morning were flawlessly, unnaturally steady. Ready for work I don't want to accept, but increasingly suspect I can't decline. The training is next Tuesday, 9 in the evening. A house in Kensington. A dying woman who wants help crossing a threshold that might reject her. I shouldn't go, but I know I will. Just as I know that once I witness the technique, I'll be asked to attempt it myself. And I know with a certainty I can't rationalize that I'll be able to do it. That I'll be one of the rare few who can see the threshold, who can guide people across, who can carry on this work even as it becomes more and more hopeless. Miss Threshold wrote in her last letter that the work transforms you, that each crossing you facilitate gives you something, that those who do it stop aging, stop being bound by the ordinary limits of mortality. She wrote that the founder had been doing it since 45, and only failed once at her own crossing, when the threshold finally refused her. She wrote that I'd likely have decades, possibly longer, to help find the answer, to understand why the threshold is sealing, to figure out what can be done. And she wrote in a postscript I've read maybe 50 times since the letter arrived, that when my own moment comes, she'll be there. She'll try to guide me through. She can't promise I'll cross. No one can anymore. But she'll try. The alternative, she wrote, is to die alone and unguided. Like everyone who doesn't know about the threshold. Like everyone who thinks death is just an ending. To die and get stuck, trapped, suspended in that space between, conscious but frozen, unable to do anything except exist in that arrested instant of refusal. Better, she suggested, to know what's coming. Better to see the threshold before you reach it. Better to understand the presence waiting on the other side, even if understanding doesn't guarantee you'll be let through. I'm writing this Monday evening. Tomorrow I'll go to Kensington. I'll watch Miss Threshold open the threshold and try to ease a dying woman's crossing. I'll watch the woman be examined, judged, possibly refused. I'll see what happens when the crossing fails. And then I suspect I'll begin my apprenticeship. I'll absorb the method. I'll become another facilitator, another shepherd for the dying, another person who will spend decades hunting for answers to why death has turned into a doorway that's slowly sealing shut. I don't want this, but I'm already reaching for the dying woman in my sleep, already trying to drag her through a threshold that pushes back. My hands are controlled, my breathing even. I'm prepared for work I never selected, but increasingly believe selected me. The files weren't accidentally placed. The agency knew I'd come to the archives. Miss Petton knew I'd discover them. Miss Threshold knew I wouldn't be able to say no. And now I understand something I didn't when I cracked open that first box. There are some things you can't unlearn. Some thresholds you can't step back across. Some knowledge that alters you just by being absorbed. Tomorrow I'll go to Kensington. I'll start the work. And I'll spend however many decades I'm given trying to decode why death itself is breaking down. Why the threshold is shutting. Why everyone who dies might soon be imprisoned in that awful gap between states, aware but unable to stop. Someone has to try. Someone has to understand. And my hands, as I write this final line, are flawlessly, impossibly steady. Story 2, When Strangers Felt Like Home. Story 2. There's a kind of quiet that doesn't just fill your ears. It crawls inside your skull and makes a home there. Marcus Webb had spent 19 winters learning the difference between silence and presence. Out here on the Obsidian Ridge, the mountain didn't just go quiet when the storms rolled in. It waited, like something ancient holding its breath. He squinted at the GPS for what felt like the 100th time. The screen's weak blue light carved out his face against the howling white void, showing him nothing but coordinates that barely mattered anymore. 1.7 miles to where the Harrison group was last pinged. 3 grad students and their advisor, out here chasing winter migration patterns or some academic ghost. Then the blizzard dropped like a fist, and now Marcus was the only fool moving through a world that had shrunk to a 10-foot bubble of wind and ice. Somewhere below, buried under the storm and the dark, was the town of Ashford. Population 900 and change, depending on who'd passed or been born since anyone bothered counting. His wife was down there now, in the house they'd scraped together 12 years back with a loan her brother resented giving, probably at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. That look she wore when he left on nights like this, not quite anger, closer to surrender. The face of someone who'd married a man and slowly realized she'd gotten a mountain instead. Cold, distant, unreadable. They'd had a daughter once. Emma had. She'd lived to 5. Been gone 11 years now, buried behind the stone chapel on the hill. Marcus didn't let himself think about Emma. Thinking required choice. What he carried was more like climate, something that just happened to him, a pressure system that rolled through without asking. But out here, alone in the screaming wind, her absence turned solid, a shape cut out of the world, a hole where light used to be. The mountain had taken her, in a way. Not directly. She died in a bright hospital room, machines beeping, nurses whispering, pneumonia that turned into something worse. But Marcus had been up here that final week, hauling two reckless climbers off a crumbling ledge. By the time he made it back down, Emma was already cold, and his wife had started wearing that look, that permanent frost. 19 years he'd been doing this. 19 years of dragging people out of the snow, of knocking on doors with news no one wanted, of standing over frozen bodies and deciding whether to call it a rescue or a recovery. Most volunteers lasted 3, maybe 4 seasons before the work carved something out of them they couldn't replace. But Marcus stayed, kept suiting up, became the name they called when the weather turned apocalyptic and someone had to go anyway. His headlamp beam dissolved into nothing. The cold wasn't just temperature, it had mass. It leaned into him, shoved back with every step. Each breath turned to frost instantly, building up on his beard, crusting the edges of his mask. Protocol said wait for the storm to ease. But something in the dispatcher's voice, Vera, who'd been running search ops longer than he had, made him go out anyway. Vera's tone on the radio had been off. That was the only way to describe it. She'd repeated the coordinates 3 times, which wasn't normal but wasn't unheard of either. What stuck with him, what lodged, like a splinter of ice in his ribs, was the silence before she gave them. Like she was reading from something that shouldn't be real, from instructions written a decade ago that were only now being acted out. And when she'd said his name, Marcus, you're certain about this? There'd been something in her voice he'd never heard before. Not worry, recognition, like she knew where he was headed, knew something about that place he didn't, and couldn't or wouldn't say it over the radio. He'd lied, of course. Told her the weather was manageable, that he'd be fine. The same lies he'd been feeding everyone for 19 years. Dispatchers, supervisors, his wife, sometimes the sheriff. The lies that kept him moving, kept him testing himself against the mountain's indifference, kept him searching for something he couldn't name but couldn't stop chasing. There was a file back at the station. Thin manila folder. Vera had shown it to him once after too many whiskeys at the Redwood Tavern. It held incident reports stretching back 50 years, all from Obsidian Ridge, all winter rescues, all involving searchers who'd gone out in impossible storms and were found days, sometimes weeks, later. If they were found at all. The folder had a name scrawled in faded ink on the tab. The Still Ones. Vera had tried explaining it, talked about hypothermia, hallucinations, the way the cold preserves what it takes. But Marcus had stopped listening after the 3rd page. Because in every report, every description of bodies pulled from the snow, there was the same strange detail. The victims had been found with expressions of deep peace, as if they'd finally encountered someone they'd been waiting their whole lives to meet. He'd asked why she kept the file. She'd looked at him with something he couldn't decode and said, "So I remember their names when the call comes through." At the time, he thought she meant for memorial services, for official records. Now, stumbling blind through the gale, he wondered if she'd meant something else entirely. Looking back implied time still moved in straight lines, which no longer felt true, Marcus wondered if Vera had been trying to warn him, if showing him that file had been her way of saying, "This is what happens. This is what the ridge does. And one day those coordinates will come through with your name on them, and I won't be able to stop you from going." The first shape materialized at the edge of his vision, where his headlamp beam bled into static. A dark vertical line, standing where everything else was horizontal chaos. Marcus turned his head. For a second, he saw nothing but the familiar maelstrom of white. Then the wind shifted and it carried a scent he couldn't place, not rot exactly. More like the smell inside a freezer that's been off too long. Something biological locked in stasis beyond its expiration date. Then he saw it clearly. A shape standing perfectly still, maybe 20 yards to his left, facing him. The gale should have knocked it sideways, should have forced it to bend or turn or shield itself, but it stood rigid as a post, like the storm was a suggestion it had chosen to ignore. Marcus had been trained for this. The manual had an entire section on phantoms, complete with photos and incident reports. Hypothermia could conjure anything. Dead family members, childhood visions given form, even copies of yourself. The brain, starved for oxygen as your core temp plummeted, would fill the void with whatever scraps it could pull from its collapsing scaffolding. He'd seen it firsthand during a drill in Wyoming, watched a teammate spend half an hour talking to his dead brother, sobbing, asking forgiveness for things that may or may not have been real. They'd warmed him up, and the ghost dissolved back into whatever corner of the mind manufactures the dead. But Marcus knew his numbers. The layers he wore, synthetic base against skin, insulating mid-layer, waterproof shell to cut the wind, had been chosen with precision. He'd been regulating his pace carefully, eating energy bars every 30 minutes like clockwork, monitoring his thoughts for drift or confusion, all designed to keep his core stable. He'd pulled frozen bodies from the snow with faces locked in strange contentment. He knew exactly what temperature their minds had been when they started seeing whatever welcomed them. He wasn't there yet, not even close, but knowing that and feeling it were two separate countries, especially when the figure was still there, unmoving in the chaos, and his own body was sending signals he didn't entirely trust. The shivering had stopped. He checked his watch, 9:12, logged the detail like his training demanded. That was bad. Your body stops shaking when it can no longer afford the energy cost of generating heat through muscle spasms, when it surrenders that expensive defense and focuses on protecting the vital core. But he'd eaten, recently, had consumed enough calories to power hours of movement. The tremors shouldn't have stopped. The shape turned. Not quickly, not like something startled or caught. The movement was slow, measured, like it existed on a different clock than everything else. Then it walked away into the white. Not fleeing, not rushing, just walking, with the kind of patience that suggested time was no longer a factor in whatever it had become. It moved northwest, directly toward the coordinates Vera had given him. Marcus stood locked in place, frozen, and wasn't that the perfect word? Wasn't that exactly what it felt like? Blood going thick in your veins, body paralyzed between instinct and reason, trying to decide if following this thing would be wisdom or suicide. He yanked out his compass, then his GPS, then the compass again, as if they might contradict each other and prove his navigation had failed instead of his mind. But they agreed. northwest, straight toward the Harrison group's last known position. He forced himself forward, snowshoes sinking and filling instantly with fresh powder. Told himself he'd seen a wind-warped tree, a rock outcrop, some optical trick born of exhaustion and the brain's endless hunt for patterns in noise. 3 winters back, he'd tracked what he was certain was a rescue chopper for half an hour, followed its lights through a storm just like this one, only to realize he'd been chasing a star. The actual helicopter had gone down 2 valleys over. By the time he found the wreckage, all 5 crew were already gone. He'd never mentioned the star to anyone, never admitted he'd burned those critical 30 minutes following something 4 light years away instead of 4 miles. Some mistakes were too intimate to confess. The second shape appeared. 10 minutes later, or maybe an hour, time had started bending, stretching, like the storm was warping its flow somehow. This one stood directly in his path. Marcus stopped so fast his momentum carried him forward an extra step, nearly pitching him into the drift. His hand shot to the flare gun at his belt, and for a split second, he glanced down at his own fingers where they gripped the holster. Something was wrong. The skin looked strange, pale, even through the thick fabric of his gloves, like the material had gone see-through, or like his hands were glowing faintly from within. He blinked hard, shook his head, told himself it was the headlamp reflecting off the falling snow. Still, the weight of the flare gun felt comforting in a way that had nothing to do with its actual usefulness. The wind had died down to almost nothing, the way it sometimes did in the heart of the storm. Those strange pockets of stillness that lasted anywhere from half a minute to several before the violence kicked back in. In that brief quiet, Marcus could finally see clearly. The shape wore no cold weather gear, just regular clothes, a plaid flannel red and black check worn at the edges, faded jeans, hiking boots that looked well-traveled. Its head was cocked at an odd angle, like it was puzzled or trying to remember something. It was a young man, mid-20s maybe, dark hair slicked flat against his skull. He looked familiar the way strangers sometimes do. That uncanny flash of recognition that makes you think you've met before, when really you've just seen enough faces that the possible combinations have started looping back. But there was something else. Something scratching at the back of Marcus's mind, like a name on the tip of his tongue he couldn't quite pull forward. "Are you with the Harrison group?" His voice sounded muffled, absorbed by the cold and the curtain of falling snow. The words seemed to travel only a few feet before vanishing, like the storm was actively deleting them. The figure didn't answer, didn't move. And Marcus understood, with a clarity that bypassed thought and came from somewhere older, somewhere beneath language, that he could see through it. Could trace the diagonal slant of the snow through its torso, through its arms, like it was made of dirty glass, like it had been built from ice and recollection, and left standing in a place where such things shouldn't be possible. He closed his eyes, counted slowly to 5, each number arriving sluggishly, like pulling it from cold storage. Opened them again. The shape was still there, undeniably present, impossible to write off as delusion now that he'd admitted its transparency. And as Marcus stood locked in place, that word again, frozen, perfect, and inescapable, he noticed other details. The figure cast no shadow in his headlamp's beam, left no tracks in the snow, and worst of all, it didn't breathe. In air this cold, every exhale should bloom visible, proof of life condensing in the frigid air. but the figure's face stayed clear, its mouth and nose producing nothing. Then the mouth opened anyway. "It's so hot in here." The voice had no tone, no feeling, no breath beneath it. Just sound, formed without air, words shaped in a throat that no longer drew oxygen. Like wind whistling through a dead tree, or ice cracking deep in a frozen lake. A simple statement delivered in a voice that suggested it was stating something self-evident, something anyone with working senses would notice. The shape lifted translucent hands and started working the buttons on its flannel. Marcus could see what lay beneath: blue-white skin, delicate veins of frost threading through the flesh like frozen capillaries, like the patterns ice etches on winter glass, like neural pathways in a brain that had stopped generating warmth or thought or anything resembling life. Its eyes held nothing but faint bewilderment, like it was trying to grasp something crucial, but the thought kept slipping away, kept retreating deeper into whatever void existed behind those hollow stares. And then Marcus knew, recognized where he'd seen this man before. 7 winters back, strange late-season blizzard. They'd pulled him from a drift where he'd apparently sat down to rest during a solo trek. Toxicology came back 3 times over the limit. Family sobbed at the service, said he'd been battling things they couldn't name. Marcus had stood in the back of the chapel, wondering what horrors the ridge could possibly hold that were worse than the ones people hauled up here themselves. "You should take your coat off." There were others now, emerging from the white like images surfacing in a developing tray, like gradual disclosures of something that had always been present but needed the right conditions to become visible. A woman in a sundress, arms wrapped tight around herself in a pointless defense against cold, lips midnight blue, eyes carrying that same faraway confusion. An older man in a business suit, tie perfectly knotted, ice clouding his beard in formations that suggested he'd been standing there for hours, or days, or years, time meaning something different to the frozen dead than it did to the breathing. A child, maybe 8 or 9, wearing pajamas printed with cartoon animals Marcus vaguely recognized from a case 6 years back. A boy who'd wandered from his family's rental cabin during a midnight bathroom trip, found 72 hours later less than half a mile from warmth, sitting upright in the snow, hands stretched toward something only he could perceive. None of them left prints. None of them threw shadows. And all of them were staring at him with that same look, that blend of bewilderment and recognition, like they'd met him somewhere but couldn't pin down when or where, like they were all reaching for the same lost memory that hovered just beyond their grasp, a name they couldn't speak. Marcus's hand fumbled for the flare gun, drew it from the holster with fingers that felt swollen and distant, like he was controlling them through thick mitts, like there was lag between thought and motion. But the mechanical weight of it grounded him, the heft of steel and polymer, the way it nested in his palm exactly like it had 1,000 times before. This was real, this he could trust. He aimed skyward and squeezed. The flare erupted in violent red brilliance, painting the snow and the apparitions, because that's what they were. No use pretending his mind was just short-circuiting in textbook ways, in shades of crimson and ink-black shadow. The shapes flinched, withdrew, melted back into the storm's cover. For a heartbeat, Marcus felt something like victory, like he'd cracked the code of this twisted new reality he'd wandered into. Light repelled them, fire held them off. This was survivable, this he could manage. He bolted forward, pack slamming against his spine, lungs screaming. The flare arced overhead and began its slow fall, light sputtering, fading. By the time it hit the snow and guttered out, the dark had swallowed everything again, and the shapes had returned. Closer now, forming a loose ring around him, mouths moving in perfect sync but producing no sound, or sounds too faint to catch over the wind, which had roared back to life as if it had only been waiting for the flare to die. The cold was deeper now. It had breached his defenses, slipped past the supposedly impenetrable barriers of synthetic shells and insulation and base layers. It was working on the flesh of him now, the warm core where life clung on through sheer chemical defiance, a stubborn refusal to accept the inevitable. He knew the symptoms, had them memorized from training, had witnessed them firsthand dozens of times. The cessation of shivering, as the body abandoned that costly method of generating warmth. The creeping deadness in extremities, starting at fingers and toes, migrating inward. The way his thoughts had started feeling thick, sluggish, like thinking through layers of fabric, like there was extra distance between forming a thought and grasping what it meant. But knowing the warning signs and being able to act on them were entirely separate problems. He had to reach the Harrison group, had to get them all to cover, start a fire, get heat back into frozen limbs. That was the job. That's why he'd climbed into the storm. Why Vera had given him those coordinates in that off-kilter voice that said she understood something he didn't. He couldn't quit now, wouldn't. Hadn't quit in 19 years, not even when quitting would have been the smarter play. The apparitions matched his pace as he drove forward. He'd fire a flare. He had 11 left, counted them before leaving the station, and they'd dissolve into the void. Then the light would sputter and die and they'd close back in, murmuring their impossible warmth, their lethal consolation. There were dozens now, a funeral procession of the frozen. And he recognized some of them from missions spanning years, faces that matched photos thrust at him by shattered families. Bodies he'd strapped to sleds or zipped into black bags and hauled down through the trees. There was Linda Chen, fell into a crevasse 4 winters back, not recovered until the spring melt. She'd been a seasoned climber, summited Rainier 9 times, Denali twice. Still, the ridge had claimed her with the same lazy indifference it showed everyone. Skill didn't matter up here. Her partner had asked Marcus at the service if she'd suffered. He'd lied, said it would have been instant, said she wouldn't have felt a thing. But he'd seen the body when they finally hauled it from the ice, seen how her arms were positioned, what was left of her expression. She'd lived down there for hours, maybe longer, waiting for help that never arrived. There was the Martinez kid, 7 years old, wandered from his family's cabin during a whiteout, found 3 days later curled beneath a Douglas fir like he was napping. The family had heard him crying for them that first night, been maybe 40 yards away in the blinding snow, but the storm ate his voice. When they found him, he was rigid, his bright yellow jacket a shocking burst of color against the endless white, his mittens still on his small hands. Marcus had carried him down, felt the unnatural weight of that tiny frozen body in his arms. Thought about Emma, how the only real difference between losing a child to illness and losing one to the mountain was how much time you got to say goodbye. There was Owen Kane, veteran guide who'd simply sat down in the snow one January morning during what should have been an easy descent, and never got back up. No wound, no clear trigger, just a choice his body made without asking permission. His climbing partner had tried everything, physically hauled him to his feet, pointed him downhill. Kane sat right back down, smiled, said he just needed a second to catch his breath. 15 minutes later, he was gone. The autopsy found nothing definitive. Maybe cardiac arrest, maybe stroke, maybe just the cumulative toll of too many seasons spent in thin air and brutal cold finally collecting its due. They all said the same thing, with slight variations. It's so warm, so beautifully warm. You should rest, you should shed those heavy clothes, they're dragging you down. Wouldn't you like to be rid of them? And the awful part, the part that made Marcus empty flare after flare until his hands, his strangely pale hands, could barely hold the gun, was that some buried part of him wanted to listen. Some piece of him understood they were telling the truth. His jacket did feel like deadweight. His layers did feel suffocating. And there was warmth somewhere close. He could almost sense it, almost touch it, if he just stopped struggling, just let go of this pointless resistance to being alone on a frozen ridge in a blizzard on Christmas Eve. He thought about his wife again, sitting at that kitchen table, waiting for a call that wouldn't come. Not until morning, when Vera or someone else from the team would show up at the door instead, because you didn't deliver certain news over the phone. He wondered how she'd react when they told her, if she'd weep, or if she'd just nod, having always understood this was how it would finish. That you couldn't love a mountain more than a person without the mountain eventually taking what it was owed. They'd had a fight once, years ago, after Emma died. She'd asked him why he kept doing it, kept marching into storms, kept staking his life for strangers when he hadn't been able to rescue his own daughter. He tried explaining, though he knew even as the words left his mouth that language couldn't carry the weight. That it was because he couldn't save Emma that he had to save everyone else. That every person dragged from the snow was a backward redemption, a tiny installment on a debt that could never be paid in full. She'd stared at him with something he couldn't decode, somewhere between sympathy and disgust. Said that wasn't how reality worked, that you couldn't barter lives like currency, couldn't swap one person for another, like they were replaceable components in some vast machine of significance. But she was mistaken, or maybe she was right and it made no difference, because this was the only way Marcus understood how to exist, the only arrangement of purpose and motion that held any coherence. Every rescue was Emma, and Emma was every rescue. And if he had to die on this ridge, had already died maybe, and was only now realizing it, then at least he'd die reaching for someone, trying to bring them back. Except he wouldn't bring anyone back. He could see it now with the brutal lucidity that came from oxygen starvation, or hypothermia, or whatever mechanism was currently taking apart his mind piece by piece. He wouldn't bring them home. He'd bring them something else, the cold, the ridge's infinite patience, the slow conversion from breathing flesh into crystallized memorial. The Harrison group would be recovered eventually, probably within days of the weather clearing. They'd be discovered in their shelter with the door torn wide and everything coated in frost. And someone would call it a tragedy, but expect it. Say you couldn't celebrate holidays on a mountain without paying tribute in blood. That nature was magnificent, but ultimately unconcerned with human endurance. And maybe years from now, another searcher would be out in a blizzard, following coordinates towards someone who needed saving. And they'd encounter the frozen procession. would see the translucent shapes keeping pace beside them, murmuring about heat and relief and how oppressively heavy their gear was. And that searcher would press on, believing they could fight it, believing they were exceptional, believing their preparation and skill and raw determination would shield them against the mountain's patient consumption of everything it touched. Marcus fired another flare. The crimson burst shoved back the night, scattered the phantoms, and in its glow he saw his hands. They looked wrong, discolored, the flesh waxy and bloodless with that particular shade of frostwhite he'd seen on bodies pulled from drifts. He'd lost his gloves somewhere, couldn't recall taking them off. Training said you never removed gloves in conditions like this. That bare skin would crystallize in minutes. But sometimes hypothermia victims did exactly that. Felt a twisted sensation of scorching heat that drove them to tear away protective layers in one last catastrophic attempt to cool themselves. His fingers throbbed with pain that felt abstract, clinical, like it was happening to someone else's anatomy entirely. He tried curling them and found them rigid, uncooperative, like they'd been whittled from timber or carved from frozen stone instead of cultivated from tissue and marrow. When he pressed his thumb against his forefinger, he registered nothing, no sensation of contact, just the dim awareness that he'd executed the movement. The GPS claimed he was nearly there, 0.4 miles. He could cover that. He drilled for this, had worked operations in weather far worse than this. Hadn't he? The cold was scrambling his recall, making it impossible to separate this blizzard from all the others, this mission from every previous one. Time was behaving strangely, looping back, collapsing. Marcus couldn't pinpoint with any certainty when he'd left the station. An hour ago, 3. The sky showed the same absolute void it had since he'd started. That specific brand of storm dark that obliterated all rhythm. That made every instant feel like daybreak and twilight and dead of night simultaneously. His watch had quit at some point, display locked at 9:12. He remembered checking it earlier, 10 minutes ago, 2 hours, and seeing that exact timestamp, which meant either the battery had failed or the cold had breached even that supposedly sealed case and frozen the electronics into uselessness. 9:12. The same moment, he'd noticed the shivering had stopped. The same time displayed on the GPS when Vera had radioed with the coordinates. Everything seemed anchored to 9:12, or everything had occurred at 9:12, and he was just experiencing the ripple effects in slow motion, stretched across subjective hours that occupied only heartbeats of actual time. Or maybe time itself had fractured, had become as unreliable as his deadened fingers, as deceptive as the snow collapsing beneath his boots. Maybe this was what happened when you crossed certain boundaries, not just of body temperature, but of reality itself. The ridge operated on different physics than the valley below, different principles than the civilized world with its central heating and functional clocks, and the comforting illusion that time flowed forward in neat lines, and people could shape their fates through skill and preparation. Up here in the storm, those illusions evaporated. Up here, the mountain imposed its own laws, and you either submitted or you perished. And sometimes submission and death were indistinguishable. A shape stepped directly into his path, close enough that Marcus could see its features with clarity. A man, maybe 40, wearing search and rescue gear identical to Marcus's own. It took several seconds for understanding to surface through the frozen sludge of his thoughts. The face was his, or a version of it, slightly younger, the eyes still holding some spark Marcus couldn't remember ever possessing. The shelter's not far now. The voice came from his twin, gentle, almost compassionate. But there's something you need to grasp first. Marcus lifted the flare gun. His grip wobbled violently. He couldn't quite recall the simple motion, the basic mechanics of squeezing metal and launching light into the void. His fingers felt bloated, foreign. When he glanced down, they seemed to emit their own faint glow, like they'd been lit from the inside by some cold, alien fire. "You've been moving for a long time," his mirror said. "Moving since you went down. Do you remember going down? You were crossing the saddle near Widow's Peak. The snow collapsed beneath you, took you over the edge. It happened fast. You probably barely registered it." "No." Marcus's voice sounded distant, like it was rising from the bottom of a well. "I'm on a mission, the Harrison Group." "You are," the double confirmed, "just not the way you believe." The shapes had enclosed him now, dozens of the frozen congregation. They'd stopped murmuring, just observed with those hollow sockets, expressions carrying neither cruelty nor mercy, only a kind of calm expectation. And Marcus understood, with a dread that pierced even the suffocating numbness, that they were waiting for him to cross over, that he'd already crossed, that this instant of recognition was the final membrane, and once it tore, he'd become completely what he'd been for hours. Another phantom of the ridge, another ignored omen for the living. "The flares," he whispered. Looked down at his hands. They pulsed softly in the blackness, pallid and waxy, radiating not heat, but a horrific chill that rippled outward in concentric rings. There was no flare gun. There never had been, not since the fall. Just his own frozen limbs locked into claws, and the hallucination that he'd been wielding light, holding back the void. "The shelter," his twin said quietly. Pointed. Through the maelstrom, Marcus could see it, a structure materializing from nothing, windows glowing amber with lantern warmth, smoke threading from the chimney in defiance of the gale. It was exquisite. It was deliverance. And as Marcus stared, he felt something wet streaming down his face, touched his cheek, found tears there, crystallized solid before they'd traveled halfway down. The shelter looked identical to the emergency stations he'd helped stock over the years. Standard forestry build, weathered timber sealed with concrete chinking, steeply pitched roof engineered to dump snow, shutters that could be locked against apocalyptic conditions. Survival gear inside. Or there should be thermal blankets, waterproof matches, preserved. Rations, a stove, everything essential for endurance. Everything that wouldn't matter now that he was delivering the cold itself. He moved toward it. The ring of phantoms parted, let him pass. And he grasped now that they hadn't been trying to mislead him. They'd been attempting to make him see, to spare him this final, unbearable task. But he'd resisted, had pressed forward through willpower or momentum, or whatever primitive wiring convinces people they can outlast anything through pure refusal. Had fired his flares, his hands, God, his luminous dead hands, and scattered them, and kept moving. And now here he stood, at the brink of rescue, at the instant when he should be slamming through that door, bringing heat and hope and the certainty of survival. Instead, he would deliver winter incarnate, would deliver the ridge's patient starvation, would deliver the cold that had already devoured him and was still ravenous. The other shapes didn't trail him now. They hung back, observing. And Marcus understood this was solitary work. A private nightmare each of the Frozen had to perform alone. They'd all enacted this before. All stumbled toward shelters or tents or bands of travelers. All convinced they were delivering salvation, until that instant of shattering clarity when they understood what they'd truly become. And then they joined the procession, walking the ridge eternally, trying to alert the next soul, trying to save them from the same recognition. Failing every time. The snow was deeper here, or his legs had given out, or both. Each stride demanded exponential effort, like wadding through setting concrete instead of powder. His breathing, was he still breathing? Could ghosts draw air? Came in ragged pulls that produced no visible mist. The golden light from the cabin windows drew nearer, but never quite arrived. And Marcus felt a lurch of vertigo, a sense that he might walk toward this structure forever, might spend eternity crossing the final 100 feet, an endless approach to a threshold he could see but never touch. But then the door was there, right in front of him. Solid timber worn smooth by seasons and wind. His hand found the latch. Inside he could hear voices, young, terrified. The harassing group debating their options, whether to hunker down or risk the push to the trailhead. Unaware that both paths led to the same terminus now that he'd found them. Inside the cabin, the four of them pressed close to the wood stove, trying to convince themselves the storm would lift by sunrise. Then a new sound cut through the gale's scream. Heavy, rhythmic, crunching through the snow just outside. Footsteps. The professor's head jerked up. Relief, sharp and agonizing, flooded his chest. Someone's here, he breathed, voice fracturing with hope. Rescue. The students whipped toward the entrance, faces lit with sudden salvation. And in that instant, they were already imagining steaming mugs, warm beds, the wild story they'd recount about their holiday nightmare and the fearless searcher who braved the blizzard to find them. The cabin door was thick timber. When Marcus kicked it, the way he'd breached dozens of doors on dozens of operations, the way protocol demanded, driving the sole of his boot against the frame just beside the lock, it exploded inward with a crack like splintering bone, like a frozen limb snapping, like everything brittle surrendering to force. The heat rolled over him and it felt like violence, like shattered glass, like acid dissolving his crystallized skin. It felt like wrong, a temperature so alien to his current form that it registered not as comfort, but as assault. The lantern glow seared after hours in blackness. Marcus had to blink through the glare before he could make out the clustered shapes against the far wall. Even then, they rippled and distorted, like the temperature gap between his frozen state and their living warmth created visible static in the air between them. He tried lifting his hand, tried waving, signaling he was here to help. But his arm moved incorrectly, jerked and twitched like a puppet controlled by someone who didn't understand anatomy. Four of them, three young, one older, the advisor. They wore proper gear, insulated jackets, technical pants, their faces flushed pink with the cabin's warmth, alive with color in a way that made Marcus suddenly, brutally aware of his own face. The waxy frost blue of it, the absence of circulation, the way his features had probably gone rigid and inhuman. They turned at the sound of the door shattering. And their expressions. Marcus would carry those expressions through whatever remained of existence, would hold them the way he held Emma's final look. That blend of confusion and acceptance as the sedatives pulled her under. Not relief, absolute horror. The girl with dark hair and wire frames made a sound. Not quite a scream, more the noise someone produces when they're fighting not to scream, when they're witnessing something so fundamentally wrong their brain refuses to process it. The professor, older than Marcus expected, maybe late 50s, graying at the temples, glasses catching the lamplight, shoved the three students behind him. A gesture both pointless and heroic, as if his living body could shield them from what Marcus had become. He tried forming words, tried saying he'd come to extract them, that they needed to follow him, that help had arrived. The thoughts existed clearly in his skull, fully articulated. I'm Marcus Webb, search and rescue. I'm here to bring you down safely. Basic language, phrases he delivered 1,000 times, words that should have been reflexive, shouldn't have required more effort than drawing breath. But what emerged from his throat wasn't language at all. Just sound, wind howling through hollowed spaces, snow settling over unmarked graves, ice groaning under impossible weight, a frozen exhalation carrying no message except the horror of his arrival. And the cabin's warmth, that precious heat they'd built with their stove and blankets and clustered bodies, was torture. Like his skin was fissuring, like his flesh was remembering what it had been and rejecting what it had become. He lurched forward, reaching with hands that had once hauled survivors from crevasses, tied rescue lines in pitch darkness, radioed coordinates that summoned helicopters bearing deliverance, hands that had cradled his dying daughter, signed loan documents and birthday cards and fatality reports, hands that were now frozen talons, pallid and pulsing with their awful radiance, delivering cold instead of salvation, death instead of rescue. The group flattened themselves against the back wall. The dark-haired girl with glasses started weeping, deep, body-shaking sobs. One of the others, a red-headed kid in a university hoodie beneath his unzipped jacket, clawed at the window latch, fingers made useless by panic. But the window was sealed shut. Or maybe Marcus's presence had already affected it, already begun the transformation that would convert this warm haven into another frozen crypt. The temperature was plummeting. Marcus could watch it happening, could witness the thermal collapse of the space they'd fought so hard to warm. Frost bloomed across the window panes, delicate ferns and crystalline flowers spreading like time-lapse footage of ice formation. Their breath, invisible moments ago in the cabin's heat, now emerged as visible clouds, each exhale proof of fatting life, of warmth bleeding into void. The lantern flame began sputtering, shifting from warm amber to ghostly blue-white. The shadows it threw grew distorted, elongated, stretching across the floorboards like grasping claws. The wood stove that had glowed cheerfully in the corner started losing its fire, metal popping and contracting in the sudden freeze. The cold came with him. The cold was him now. And he understood this was the mechanism. This was how the ridge maintained its ledger. You died out there in the white, but some stubborn fragment kept moving, kept clinging to the mission, kept believing you could rescue one more soul. And then you found them, and you delivered the cold. And they died too, and joined the frozen procession, and the mountain collected its tribute. I'm sorry. He tried saying it, but the words dissolved into wind. The professor had drawn the three students tighter, as if his living frame could protect them from what Marcus had become. The frost crawled across the floor now, exquisite and lethal, crystalline patterns like blossoms, like ferns, like all of winter's delicate, murderous artistry. The cabin's heat was evacuating, pouring through the shattered door. Soon this place would be just another grave site on the ridge, just another location where they'd recover bodies huddled together, seeking comfort in each other's final warmth. Marcus wanted to retreat, to turn and dissolve back into the storm, to spare them this. But he couldn't remember how to move backward, could only stand rigid in the doorway, a monument to good intentions perverted, delivering his catastrophic gift of winter to those who'd sought shelter. His final coherent thought, before even thinking became impossible, was that the ridge had taught him its ultimate truth. That the cruelest thing you could do wasn't abandoning someone in their desperation. It was arriving to help. Outside, the blizzard surged. The ring of phantoms drifted closer to the cabin. And far below at the station, Vera would wait by the radio for transmission that would never crackle through, knowing without knowing, understanding the way people comprehend tragedy distantly, theoretically, until dawn broke and the recovery teams deployed and discovered what the mountain had crafted. In the corner, the 4 members of the Harrison expedition clung to each other, watched the frost climb the walls. The lantern died. The black was total. And in that blackness, they heard footsteps. Not one said. Many, approaching through the snow, drawn by the cold, by the hunger, by whatever gravity the newly dead exerted on those who'd perished before. The cabin door remained torn open. The storm poured in. The mountain kept its silence. And Christmas Eve became Christmas morning, the way such transitions always occurred in the high places. Quietly, inevitably, without observers or ritual. Just the snow descending and descending, blanketing everything, rendering it all pristine and white and hushed. Peaceful, almost warm,